Hi, folks. Hello, and welcome to what is likely going to be my magnum opus, at least for YouTube purposes. Hello, for anyone that doesn't know me, I am Dalton Mortimer, otherwise known as the Authenticator, and I am one of the foremost fans of magic user characters within comics, probably in the whole world. I say one because I'm probably if you ranked us all on a like top 10 list, I would probably be somewhere near the bottom because believe it or not, there are people who are way more obsessive about this than me. But the purpose of this three-part series of videos, I told you it was a magnum opus, um, is basically the fundamental issue that hardly anyone knows or cares about these characters. And that is a travesty that I intend to re-educate, quote unquote. By the third section of this doctoral thesis of mine, which is yes a pun because they're both characters with the prefix doctor in them, you know. But when I'm done, you will have everything you need to know about these characters to be a competent fan of these characters. I emphasize the competency part because those few that do know about them don't know jack shit about them, and they just glom on like a bunch of tailcoat riding hipsters. And this must also be corrected. Anyway, getting into the meat of the matter here, folks. See, the first question you hear inanely on the internets here, and inexorably, is the argument of who came first. It is the quintessential argument between people who think they're Doctor Strange and Dr. Fate fans and aren't. So let's start with the easiest question to answer, alright? Who came first? Simple answer, Dr. Fate. He first appeared in More Fun Comics number 55 in 1940. However, there's a slightly more important secondary question that I find is usually implicit in that first question. Namely, when people ask which came first, they're usually asking it in the context of one of them is very clearly a ripoff of the other, so who ripped who off? And here's where we get into the interesting part. Because the answer to that question is neither. And therefore, here is the part where I have to explain, because that doesn't intuitively make sense to a lot of people. But hopefully you'll understand by the time I am finished with this particular section of this particular chapter of the saga here. See, in order to understand why the answer to that question is neither, you have to understand how the characters were created in the first place, not their in-universe origins. We will get to that before the end of this stream, but what's slightly more meaningful in the context of who ripped off who question is how the characters were conceived in the minds of the people who created their stories in the first place. And in order to understand that, you have to understand a little bit of history. See, if let's, do things in somewhat chronological order here and start with Dr. Fate. In order to understand how the character of Dr. Fate came into being, you have to understand a couple of things. Number one, I suppose we should begin with the guy who actually is responsible for creating not just Dr. Fate, but also the Spectre and several other characters, although those are, for my purposes, being a fan of magic users, the two that I care the most about. Anyway, Gardner Fox was a fan and protege of the group of authors, most notably H.P. Lovecraft, who were sort of the precursors to the comic book genre. Before there were comic books, there were pulp magazines. And in pulp magazines, there was a subgenre which was the name of which was coined by H.P. Lovecraft, known as weird fiction. And long story short, Gardner Fox was a massive, massive H.P. Lovecraft fanboy. But even that is not enough to explain where Dr. Fate came from. If you want to know that, you have to keep in mind that this is happening in the early months of 1940. And in that time period, the history of sort of Western intelligentsia was going through a bit of a paradigm shift because there was this thing known as the occult revival movement, headed by people such as Aleister Crowley, Samuel MacGregor Mathers, Helena Blavatsky, and so on. And it was the time of massive popularity among intellectuals of the occult. Things like the Golden Dawn, the Rosicrucians, Scottish Rite Freemasonry, all of that business, although the occultism of Scottish Rite Freemasonry is kind of a non-thing, but that's a rant for an entirely different day. And the third component that gives rise ultimately to Dr. Fate is Egyptomania. Because again, 1940s. And in the 1940s, there was an absolute obsession. There was a craze about the mysteries of ancient Egypt that were just then being uncovered by archaeologists. And out of this mix of ideas, the Lovecraft fanboyism, the Egyptomania, the rise of Western occultism, and in particular ritual formalized magic, we got Dr. Fate. And this is essentially how neither of them is a ripoff of the other, because they come from very different philosophical backgrounds. But point being, those were the things that led to the creation of Dr. Fate. And I suppose now would be as good a time as any to get into the actual origin of the character. The origin of Dr. Fate begins with an archaeologist, Sven Nielsen, who is uncovering a tomb in Mesopotamia. See, I told you the Egyptomania would come in handy here. And so he takes his son, Kent, along, whose mother is a spiritualist. Again, this ties into the occultism revival and spiritualism movement and so on and so forth that were happening in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And they uncover the tomb of a Babylonian deity by the name of Nabu, who is, yes, actually the name of the Babylonian god of wisdom. Unfortunately for Kent, but fortunately for the readers and the rest of Dr. Fate's continuity, unbeknownst to either Sven or his son, waking him up unleashes toxic gas, which then proceeds to kill Sven. And now our intrepid Kent is without a father figure. Nabu wakes up, sees the boy, and decides that he is going to take pity on the boy, so he wipes his memory of his father so that he will stop crying, and then proceeds to raise him in the mysteries of the occult for 20 or so years. Unfortunately, and unbeknownst to Kent, again, Nabu is an immortal being who's trapped in a mortal form for the purposes of helping humanity, and that mortal form was put in stasis specifically because it was decaying. And so, come the time when Kent obtains some degree of mastery over his magic and also obtains manhood, Nabu needs to shove off his literal mortal coil and regain his godly status. Unfortunately for Nabu, however, he's caught feelings, i.e., he raised a child and now he cares for said child. And so rather than shove off his mortal coil and return to his godlike status as a Lord of Order like he should, he decides, after unfortunately allowing the memories of Kent's original father to resurface so that Kent will kill him, um, that he is going to remain bound to the earth to protect his adoptive son. And you can see why all of this being ignored in perpetuity pisses me right the hell off, because this is an amazing story of a deity essentially falling to the weakness of humanity and caring for a child, and then that child proceeding to become the world's greatest sorcerer. This all gets thrown out the window when you throw in the possession thing, but we're not talking about the things that piss me off about what this character has done today. We're talking about the origins. And that essentially is the origin of Dr. Fate. Now, comparatively, on to Doctor Strange, because as I told you, neither of them rips off the other one. And once again, in order to understand this, you have to look at the context. Doctor Strange, unlike Dr. Fate, was created or born, metaphorically speaking, in 1963 at the behest of one Steve Ditko, with some assistance from Stan Lee. And I know that's kind of flippant of what I just said there, but I'm willing to give Stan Lee almost full credit for Spider-Man, for most of the things that define the character were his ideas. By that same token, however, Stan Lee does not get any credit, or at least very minimal credit, for Doctor Strange, because 90% of the ideas that fed into the creation of Doctor Strange were Steve Ditko's idea. And once again, let's go through the sort of philosophical and historical backing of these characters. Doctor Strange, unlike Dr. Fate, was not born out of ritualized 19th century westernized magic that had its roots in Sumeria, Babylon, and Egypt. He was born out of the 1960s flower power and new age revival culture, which had a lot of influence from the fact that, just like in Dr. Fate's day, when everyone had Egyptomania, the hippie culture of the 60s, especially the more mystical new agey types, were influenced not by Egypt, Babylon, and Sumeria, but by Eastern mysticism such as Kung Fu, such as Taoism, such as Buddhism, and in particular, the archaeological and anthropological discoveries being made in Tibet at the time. Also, a large part of Doctor Strange's character is due, in no small part, to the popularity of very much Asian or Eastern influenced characters like Chandu the Magician. And in particular, a movie that Steve Ditko saw in 1963, starring Master Vincent Price, the polymath actor who, frankly, is descended from a better breed of actor than we have in the modern day. Ergo, we have Steve Ditko being kind of a connoisseur of obscure philosophies. I mean, the man is most famous for being a Randian objectivist, but he did, like most people in the 60s, go through a phase where he tried to square the circle of Randian objectivist and self-interested philosophy with Buddhism, which kind of necessity requires you to decentralize the self and forego all attachments. Gotta love the wackos, man. You really gotta love the philosophically unmoored wandering wackos that just I want to take a little bit of this philosophy and a little bit of this contradictory philosophy and scoosh them together because I want to. And yeah, that's I think that Ko was by all accounts a curmudgeonly weirdo and kind of an asshole and a loner, but again, you gotta love the wackos and eat your heart out, Alan Moore. Steve Ditko was doing the I'm gonna take random occult philosophies and scoosh them together thing long before Alan Moore decided he was going to do it. There would be no there would be no Alan Moore if there were not a Gardner Fox and or a Steve Ditko. So yes, that is sort of the underlying underpinnings of Dr. Fate and Dr. Strange. One of them is very much born of 19th century occultism of the Western ritualistic Golden Dawn Aleister Crowley variety, and one of them is very much dawned from 60s psychedelia, the New Age revival, Buddhism, and other mystical philosophies from the eastern part of the world, and of course the drug trip or the psychonaut atmosphere, because that was also a thing that very heavily influenced and was influenced by Doctor Strange. And this is another interesting thing. Not only was Doctor Strange very much influenced by drug culture and psychedelia, but he also gave as good as he got with regards to it, because so many of the prog rockers of the 60s, such as the Doors, such as Pink Floyd, were apparently massive Doctor Strange fans, to the point that the Pink Floyd album Saucerful of Secrets literally contains Doctor Strange art on it. And there is, I believe it's a Doors song that contains the line, Doctor Strange is always changing size. Wonder what they were doing while they were getting high and writing music that day. Could it have been reading a Doctor Strange comic? I love the impact that these characters have had, both, in terms of epitomizing the various movements of the time, but also kind of influencing them. And what's really funny to me is that both of these characters wound up having the title of Doctor for completely separate reasons, and yet they both also call back to the phenomena of the Renaissance, where magical practitioners would often be referred to as doctors, such as Dr. John Dee, Dr. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, who most famously wrote the 3 books of occult philosophy, which are the quintessential text for medieval occultism, and so on. As for that, speaking of neither of them ripped off each other thing, Dr. Fate's doctorate, which he actually does have one, comes from the fact that after he murdered his adoptive father at his own adoptive father's behest, i.e., he released Naboo's spirit back into the ether so that he could ascend back to godhood, and then Naboo went, yeah, but I still care about this kid, and I care about the mortal plane, so despite the fact that I'm a freaking Lord of Order, I'm gonna break the rules and create a helmet so that I can be an advisor to my son. And by the way, we will get into that whole rigmarole later, but long story short, one of the reasons I hate the possession retcon so much is because Naboo's role in the partnership that he takes on with Kent is as an advisor and to occasionally amplify Kent's already existent magic. Because here's the other thing. Unlike 90% of the other incarnations of this character, Naboo didn't have to give Kent magic. He was already an accomplished magic user before even donning the helmet, and could still use quite a lot of magic outside of having the helmet. It's just a matter of the protective enchantments on the helm extend to Kent when he's wearing it, which make him more powerful. That's a rant for another day. As is the fact that Doctor Strange and his whole origin is regularly shat upon, which I suppose we should actually get into Doctor Strange's origin. Unlike Kent, who was raised in magic, our boy Strange had the unfortunate misfortune of growing up in an almost entirely secular environment, and he became a doctor. But he didn't become a doctor to, heal people. even though that's what he thought he was doing. He became a doctor because of the prestige and the glory. And here in his origin, we have something similar to Ebenezer Scrooge or John Valjean in the sense that he is a man who has everything, appreciates nothing, and now the universe has decided he must suffer. Most people have seen the movie up until this point, so I won't bother going into the he was in a car accident and lost the use of his hands. I will, however, go into why and what it amounted to in the comic because the movie completely botched that entirely. As I said, Stephen Strange, prior to sorcery, was a asshole. Like we're talking one step away from mad scientist villainy levels of asshole. He basically is an even more exaggerated version of Dr. Gregory House from House. And he's also, as I said earlier, a man who has everything at his literal fingertips and appreciates nothing. And so the universe, again, kind of going in a Buddhist direction here a little bit, decides you have everything, you appreciate nothing. So what if we violently and painfully took it away from you and made you earn every last ounce of it back to the point that you become a better, humbler person? And then, of course, Doctor Strange loses hope with traditional Western medicine and buggers off to the east, Tibet, a city known as Kamartaj, to study with the Ancient One after having the message of you are not the center of the goddamn universe, and by the way, magic exists, beaten into his head repeatedly. And so much so that he actually kind of flips the script. And this is another thing that the modern Doctor Strange gets wrong about Sorcerer Doctor Strange. Sorcerer Doctor Strange's problem is not arrogance, because by this point in his origin, he has had the shit kicked out of him to the point that he actually pathologically aspires to be humble. He mimics the humility of the Ancient One so badly that people actually have to tell him to have self-interest. But again, I'm not making this episode about the things that the character has done wrong over the years. That there will be time in that for there will be time in that for there will be time for that in the third episode of the series. The second episode is going to answer the other question that casual fans of these characters have, which is kind of stupid, but I'm going to play the game where the game is being played, which is the versus question. And I suppose that's as good a place as any to leave this particular section of live stream. And I'm going to break lecture mode and actually address the comments now for at least a minute. Let's see. Uh, um, I'm flying solo today, guys. For all of those wondering where E is, that like I said, this is kind of going to be my magnum opus. You guys might not be used to this, given that normally when I post solo videos, it's over on the movie channel. But frankly, I've gotten sick of so many people not understanding these characters, and a thought occurred to me where I'm like, well, better strike a light than curse the damn darkness. If people don't know these characters, then someone needs to explain these characters. And so here we are. Because if no one else is going to do it, then I'm going to do it. Um, um, Point of order, Jay. You haven't paid anything because I haven't received any super chats yet. So you have not paid for anything. So don't tell me you paid for Eglantine. You haven't yet. not that I'm actually asking for super chats. I'm just saying, don't be telling me you paid for things when you self-evidently haven't paid for things yet. Yeah, but I suppose, barring a glance or two at the chat, this does sort of conclude the rant. I guess I should deliver my closing statement, because kind of my opening statement was people don't understand these characters, so I am going to do a three-part series where I explain these characters. And this episode, if I had had space in the title, would have been subtitled background background, conception, and origins, but I didn't have space in the title. So, so be it. Uh, the next part of this series will be answering, as I said earlier, the versus question. I hope that in this particular section of the live stream, you've come to appreciate not just that Doctor Strange and Dr. Fate are not ripoffs of each other, and um were interestingly conceived in independent from each other, which in and of itself is kind of interesting given that they are very similar otherwise. But also, if you didn't know the history of the two 20th century occult movements, i.e., the 19th century high ritual magic and spiritualism one of uh, Aleister Crowley, H.P. Lovecraft, and of course Samuel Margaret Mather's type thing, and or the New Age revival in the 60s that led to a bunch of psychonauting, you now know. And you also now know that, interestingly, not only are these characters independent from each other, they kind of are avatars of two different schools of thought with regards to magical and occult philosophy. You've got Fate, who is the embodiment of everything Western, formalized, and rooted in Egyptian, Babylonian, um, Sumerian, and even to some extent like medieval Christian magical systems. And then you've got Fate, who is very much the opposite. He's very much rooted in Taoism and Buddhism and Kung Fu and etc. So not only are they independent from one another, they sort of exemplify the two poles or the two schools of thought within magic. You've got Western ritualized formal ritual magic, and you've got Eastern sort of uh, personal energy manipulation and personal enlightenment based magic. So that is the lesson I want everyone to take away from this: is neither of them is a ripoff from each other, and they exemplify two very interesting strains of occultism that had a massive impact on various different levels of history. Yeah, Crowley was a buffoon, but he was a dangerous buffoon because he had actual power. And there is nothing more dangerous than a buffoon with actual power. That's why I keep mentioning Samuel Mathers in relation to him, because this is a complete and utter sidebar, but I am obsessed with magic both in comics and in real life because I've been an occultist myself for 16 freaking years, which is why I'm kind of the person, maybe not most qualified, but the most likely to have made this connection between the real life historical elements of the creation of these characters and also kind of how they balance and mirror each other. But my point is, getting back to what I was saying about Crowley. The reason I always mention Mathers in relation to Crowley is because for the portion of Aleister Crowley's life where he was the most sane, it was kind of Mather's job to keep Crowley on a leash, and he successfully managed to do so, which is why we have Mathers and Crowley's translation of things like the Greater and Lesser Keys of Solomon. I doubt very much that Crowley could have managed that on his own, because after he and Mathers had a breakup, and in so doing kind of collapsed the Golden Dawn from inside itself, Crowley went off the deep end and became more and more and more egotistical. Whereas Mathers, by all accounts, had a fairly happy life after Crowley left him, which, should tell you everything about who was doing most of the actual work in that partnership. Crowley may have had more overt power, but Mathers knew what to do with that power. And that in and of itself is sort of a magical lesson if anyone's inclined to take it. I already covered that. We've already gone through the origins into disguise. One is Kent Nelson, the son of an archaeologist and a spiritualist, and the adoptive son of a quasi deity in the DC universe. And one is a surgeon who had everything, appreciated nothing, and so the universe bitch smacked him until he had to re-earn everything he lost and then some. And then he went from being pathologically arrogant to pathologically humble, something that I wish the MCU would take notes of, because they seem to be convinced, as do most modern day Doctor Strange writers, that his arrogance carried over from his time as a doctor to his time as a sorcerer, and that is not the case. Pre-sorcery, his problem was arrogance. Post-sorcery, his problem is pathological self-sacrifice and humility, to the point that it almost comes across as a death wish. Because he's overcompensating, because he hates the fact that he was arrogant so much that he tries to be pathologically humble to counterbalance. Jay, you have to understand, I've been at this for 16 years, and I've been told that many, many times. It's it it's not I'm sorry, but my occultism is how I interface with the metaphysical, and that's not going to change. It is dangerous, but if if you are if you are well educated and rational, it doesn't have to be necessarily. I'm not saying you're wrong, because magic is very dangerous and people shouldn't fiddle with it. Look at what happened to Crowley after he no longer had Mathers keeping him on a leash, or the rest of the Golden Dawn to keep him centered. He kind of went nuts. But most things worth doing are somehow dangerous, and I firmly believe that magic is one of those things that is worth doing. Therefore, I shall continue. Because it is the very core of my being. There's a reason why I, a 16-year veteran of the occult, also really, really, really love magic users in fiction and comics, because frankly, magic is the center of my being. It's what I'm here to do in life. And if I didn't have it, I would just as soon not be alive. So I'm gonna keep it. It's the thing that keeps me whole. I'm not getting rid of it just because people think it's dangerous for various reasons. Frankly, I don't really have much to do with the Abrahamic God or the archangel with daddy issues. I'm a polytheist. Yahweh and Lucifer can duke it out in the corner all they want. I'm more interested in other pantheons of deities. But that's getting way too much into actual religion conversation, and that is far beyond my mandate, and Eglintine's probably going to yell at me for that later. So I'm not gonna get much further into that. Yep, yep, no, it should. And keeping it in a more positive direction, because we just almost went into a very heavy abyss there for a second. one of the reasons I love comics in particular is they are one of the only kinds of fiction that treat the occult or magic with anything resembling like a level of seriousness. Obviously, they scale it up to make it, actiony and so that characters can throw lightning and whatnot at each other. But they at least these characters were created by people who at the very least knew enough about these things to treat them seriously. In a lot of fantasy fiction, magic is basically a glorified synonym for a deus ex machina, i.e., magic doesn't have a definition, so we can just make the definition whatever we want, which neither of those things are true. Magic, in fact, does have many succinct definitions. And I say many because, yes, there's some disagreement between practitioners as to how magic should be defined. I have my own personal definition, but I'm not here to lecture you about literal occult philosophy as much as I tied in literal occult philosophy with, the characters, because again, it's kind of necessary to point out that no matter what any number of casual Doctor Strange and Doctor Fate fans will tell you, neither of them is a ripoff of each other, and it's kind of miraculous, or I suppose in this context you could say magical, that they both kind of became, without even anyone intending them to become, avatars of the two different sort of philosophical strains within magic. East versus West, ritualized formal occultism versus sort of Buddhist or Taoist definitions of sort of manipulating nature at its base level and so on. So it's fascinating that happened. It's also fascinating that they both ended up with the prefix doctor in their name, even though neither of them, and this often does annoy me, has that doctorate because they're doctors of magic, which should be enough, frankly. One has an archaeology degree out of deference for his mortal father, and one of them used to be a medical doctor. But you can kind of implicitly throw in, because they are both the magical experts of their respective universes, they also are doctors of magic, much like a John Dee or a Henry Agrippa or those sorts of people in the Middle Ages who actually did have doctorates in magic, or even in the more modern context, the notion of a conjure doctor in things like root work, hoodoo, conjure, etc. Don't get me started on how much I hate illusionists, please. We will be here all day. And that's probably a rant more aptly to be saved when I eventually do a version of this that's Zatanna focused. I, yeah. Long story short, I find the entire profession of stage illusionists to be a bunch of well poisoning fuckheads who need to stop calling what they do magic, which is the main issue I have with them. If they just were honest and called themselves illusionists, I wouldn't have as much a problem with it. My issue is they call it magic and then poison the well for all the normies, because most people don't even know what magic is. And if your first exposure to what magic is a stage illusionist, then you're more likely to think, well, if they're faking their shit, then it's all bullshit, which is wrong, because what they call magic has nothing in common with anything resembling philosophical occult magic at all. And I especially hate the sage illusionists who also moonlight as professional skeptics and debunkers, because it's not enough that they fake their shit and poison the well against real magic, but they have to go and try to undo people who actually try to practice it. Now, granted, there are some people who are fakers, and that's a problem. And frankly, in that aspect, they're doing quote unquote God's work, if you like. But like, I much prefer illusionists who stay in their fucking lane and don't call it magic, because that would solve 90% of my problem. And in fairness, I'm not the only magical practitioner who has that hatred of illusionists. Because the reason why you see metaphysical magic, actual magic, paranormal magic spelled with a K a lot of the time is because Aleister Crowley got so sick of having this conversation of, no, I don't do stage magic, I do magic. He literally went back to Latin, the word magica, which has a K in it, and added the K to the word magic to differentiate proper occult paranormal metaphysical magic from stage illusion. He shouldn't have had to do that, but that's the one thing Alistair and I can agree on. Fuck the stage illusionist entirely. Yeah, sorry. I can't not do that. I'm sorry. I can't not curse when I get fired up. It's just it's a thing. Anyway, I have gone on probably longer than I should have, and England's probably going to yell at me for taking it so far afield. But hey, it's what you guys were talking about in the chat. So if he yells at me, I'm at least taking some of y'all down with me because I'm not dealing with the you ruined my channel conversation alone. So I guess that's where we should call it, unless anyone has any final parting remarks. Um, Cursed objects or houses related to magic. Um, no, they're related. They're definitely related. That's usually what happens when people who meddle with shit or dabble um, don't know what they're doing, and or the result of some actual tragedy. Because sadly enough, you don't have to go out of your way to try and curse something for something to be cursed. In the same way as you don't have to try to summon a ghost for a thing to become haunted. Usually, it's the result of misused malignant energy. It's basically the metaphysical equivalent of cancer. When you misuse or there's something unhealthy about the way you're using your own life force or someone else's, or just circumstances conspired to make someone's life end in tragedy, you wind up with objects with negative energy attached or hauntings, generally. Um, yeah, no, I've already said the portion of the rant that I had earmarked for today with regards to Doctor Strange and Doctor Fate. It probably ended like 10 minutes ago because I decided to read the chat because I knew I was ignoring it, and now people have gotten me off into secondary rants. Which I'm not gonna not read the chat because that's part of the reason I do live streams is because it helps me to know people are actually watching me when I'm talking. Um, Whereas when I record, it's a sea of ums and ahs while I try to get my thoughts together. But if I know someone is actually watching, then I can actually talk to or at them, and therefore it makes doing what I do a lot easier. But as a result, it often ends up being me ranting for half an hour to an hour on the topic at hand, and then immediately going, shit, I didn't address the chat. I need to address the chat. And then spending the next 10 or 20 minutes addressing the chat, like today. So you can't say I didn't at least try to address the chat. And on that note, I am going to end the stream, folks, because we've already gone several layers of far afield and several things that are probably going to get me yelled at. So, it's a normal day. If you enjoyed this, please leave a like and please comment and please send it around to anyone you feel could benefit from any of this information, so that it gets enough views that Englentine lets me do this again. Um, and other than that, I will talk to you guys later, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers, guys.